Hello, I'm Mriganka Awati, senior writer at Heritage Insights. We're celebrating International Open Access Week by featuring diverse perspectives from industry experts on open access. The theme this year is Open for Climate Justice, and I'm speaking with Rachel Martin, who is Global Director of Sustainability at Elsevier. Rachel, thank you so much for making time for this interview.
Great to be here. And on a conversation I love so dear.
Right. So let's begin by talking a little bit about your work. What does your role as Global Director of Sustainability involve?
So I'm very lucky and very privileged to work with loads of great people within Elsevier. I head up our climate action program, and I also work with a very close team in order to drive our SDG approach. And it's not just about talking about open access, or it's not just about talking about sustainability. It's also about driving projects, creating a sustainability mindset. And I'm very privileged to work in the industry, working on great groups such as the HESI SDG Publishers Compact Fellows, which CACTUS is part of, and also a new group in STM, also looking at SDGs and working on great things such as an SDG book club for children and the SDG Publishers Compact as well. So really looking at how do we as an industry accelerate our own actions and contributions to the SDGs.
Right, that sounds great. And maybe, so you mentioned that you were part of the team that launched the UN SDG Publishers Compact. So what have your observations been on the level of interest and commitment with respect to publishing climate research open access?
So first off, I mean, the Publishers Compact was launched back in 2020, which was the start of the decade of action, where the UN really wanted to accelerate not just an awareness of sustainability, but also to drive action here. And the Publishers Compact came at that exact moment, 10 concrete steps, which kind of went from the very basics, so, creating somebody who might be responsible for SDGs, to really thinking about content. And so they're incredibly broad, and they were designed for not just academic publishing, but also trade, education, children's publishers. So everyone from that little indie publisher in Brooklyn to a big giant such as Elsevier. And so what we found was when we launched this, the people who really responded quite quickly and passionately happened to be academic publishers, right? We know research is needed to drive progress on SDGs. And so it just made a lot of sense that Emeralds, Bring in Nature, Taylor and Francis, ALPS, and STM were one amongst the first to kind of sign up. And since then, we've nearly got, I think we're up to nearly 300 signatories. So we see that movement happening within the industry. And like I mentioned before, these are quite general. They're not for academic publishing specifically. And what we've found is that actually, these groups, academic publishers came together and went, well, we could do more, right? If we think about our own workflows and our own processes, how do we accelerate progress here? And so these forums were created both at HESI and at STM. And we're starting to think through stuff. So what we've done at the HESI group, for example, is a top 10 tips. If you're a publisher, if you're an editor, where do you start? How can you perhaps integrate SDGs into your aims and scope? How might you think about encouraging authors to associate their work to SDG themes and goals? And so those are great starting blocks to get us to start thinking about how we as publishers might already support what we see is happening in the universities and institutions anyway. They're all very much focused on societal impact. They're aware of climate change. They're working on, energy research. They're working on things such as diversity and inclusion. And so how can we work together and support? And these forums are creating movement and, passionate people coming together and really thinking about, okay, how do we move forward on it? And so I think that has been one of the most inspiring outputs from the compact.
Now, of course, it's quite well established now that the impacts of climate change are unequal. That they will affect different sections of the society differently, and especially traditionally underprivileged groups are at higher risk. So, What, in your opinion, are the biggest barriers to promoting climate justice?
So I think maybe if we step back for a moment. So climate justice is a big topic. And I think it's good to think about this from a sustainable development goals perspective. So there's not one SDG related to human rights. So there's 17 goals. One, SDG 1 is about no poverty, and SDG 16 is about peace, justice, and strong institutions. But there's not one dedicated for human rights. And it was by design, because it means that if you're going to take climate action, you also need to consider the human rights aspect of it. So I think it's estimated around 90% of the targets have this human rights element to it. And it's about looking at climate action and equating that to social considerations. And, you can see that climate impacts, as you said, now affect every continent on this earth. And so it's simply exacerbating those inequitable social conditions that we are already witnessing. And so you can think about, and I'll give you a very general example. We know minority populations tend to live in big cities. We know climate change is increasing air pollution. So who's at most risk of the health effects of climate change? Vulnerable populations. So when I think about barriers to climate justice and perhaps relate this to research, what we have to think about is who's advocating for this climate justice. Whose voices are we hearing and whose voices are we listening to? And I think in the world, as we mentioned before, inclusive research is one of the most important barriers that we need to think about. And maybe not barriers, the wrong word, maybe it's opportunities, but we need to think that, research that proves climate change is happening is not needed. Last year, Cornell University released a study which said the scientific consensus around climate change, the fact that it's happening, the fact that it's caused by humans, is at about 99.1%, which means that this puts it on the same fact level as like plate tectonics or the theory of evolution. So we don't need more research which really looks at that. What we need to do is we need to think about how are we looking at the effects of climate change on these vulnerable populations? It was interesting, again, if we use COVID as a case example, when we were thinking about, okay, well, how do we make sure that everybody in all the populations are looking at vaccines? How do we make sure that, our models consider the differences between males and females or ethnic populations? This is the type of research that we need to think about. And we need to then think about the second barrier, which is around communication. Right? Whose voices are we listening to? Because if we think about collaborations or we think about rewards and recognitions, it is still skewed to this system where we're looking at citations, we're looking at centers of excellence that have been traditionally established for many hundreds of years. But, a couple of, I think days ago, actually, I was distressed to find my own country, Australia, has been the first to be condemned by the UN as violating islanders' rights. So the first to be kind of found to be in violation of climate justice. And it was interesting because within that case study, what they were found to be guilty on wasn't around climate adaptation, right? They couldn't prove that the Australian government hadn't moved fast enough. What they were in violation was climate mitigation. The fact that they didn't build a seawall to protect rising sea level in two of the islands in Torres Strait meant that a whole generation of Torres Strait Islanders could no longer, pass their culture, their traditions, their way of life on to the next generation. And I think that that's what we have to think about. It's not about potentially looking at, particularly in climate justice, this particular area, it's not about looking at, the new innovations. Yes, they're needed. Yes, they will happen. But it's also looking about how do we get the research into the hands of the people who are going to use it. Why wasn't a seawall, which is not a big technological advancement, built in the area that it was needed? And so there, I think it's collaboration. It'd be interesting to see, how global South and global North collaborations will impact, particularly when we think about climate action. If you think of solar energy, for example, many of the countries that receive a lot of sunlight happen to be in global South areas. Are there centers of excellence there? If I think about things such as climate mitigation, it's interesting to consider, our global south countries who are most at risk of feeling the effects of climate change collaborating with each other, sharing those ideas? Or are we expecting the global north to come down and tell the global south what they should be doing or what they shouldn't be doing? So I think those dynamics there are really important, because if I think of the Torres Straits, for example, are they talking to other global south or nations at risk of rising sea levels? Are they looking at solutions that might work in two different spots, or looking at the local context? And so I feel like these areas, inclusive research, but also collaboration and the communication about what's coming out, intersect a little bit. And that's where I think barriers, but opportunities for climate action and to accelerate areas which will protect vulnerable populations could really be optimized.
So in terms of putting all of that research into the hands of those who are most at risk, I think that's, so do you believe open access publishing in particular, can it play a role there in first maybe accelerating action, and secondly promoting climate justice?
So I think at the heart of it, open access and open science is a movement that is beneficial. I truly believe that, open science and all the things that it involves, whether that's open data, whether that's open articles, whether that's, putting your research out earlier, all of that can help accelerate. It can also help improve communications, and that's a good thing. So I think, fundamental. The second thing we have to think about is science communications. And again, it goes back to that point. Whose voices are we listening to and whose voices are we hearing? And I think there you have to think about, if I'm a policymaker, I believe there's about 325,000 articles about renewable energy that's published every year. You're not going to read all of that. So you're reliant on these synoptic science. And so I feel like an element here is about not just open access research or research in general or increasing research. I think it's about the quality. What's interesting to see is that the IPCC, which is the scientific body of the UN that advises their climate commission, they obviously do their synoptic science reports that get put out, very influential, really important for policymakers and science advisors alike. And what we see there, at least, our two big flagship journals, so One Earth and Jewel, both self-pressed titles, they were quoted or cited 72 and 42 times respectively. So you get the idea that this is about quality. It is really about quality. It's making sure that, you're not just publishing any old thing that goes out. It has to be peer reviewed. It has to be reliable. Our job, first and foremost, is to make sure that the science that we base any decision on is good and replicable and reliable. And I think that that is the fundamental part of where climate action. Now, I'll be completely honest, the contributions of scientists over the past 40 years on climate change has been phenomenal, monumental. I mean, we know an incredible amount of what climate change is and what's happening, and yet action hasn't happened. I mean, we're still in the position where, we're fighting certain battles, political decisions are made because they're political. We have to start thinking about what is action and what does that mean? And interestingly enough, we held a roundtable discussion last year, specifically on renewable energy. And we came up with a set of recommendations. And the idea was that, how do we as publishers, what drivers might we have in order to help facilitate that? Open access is definitely one. The other is, how do you explain in a truthful way the trade-offs that are here? If we really think about, and I'll take renewable energy, the International Energy Association has done a net zero pathway. One of their kind of scenarios is that we need to increase biofuel. So we need to have land in order to create biofuel. But of course, that comes off a trade-off in terms of our agricultural and food produce. So how does that work? If you're a policymaker, what do you need to make that balance? And it's the trade-offs which are very misunderstood, I think, within the general public, that, we do need to have these things. It's not going to be an easy. And on top of that, we'll have the effects of climate change coming through as well. So what I'd like to see is, open access, great, fantastic. Open science, even better, right? We've got data, we've got different things, we've got rewards and recognitions. We start thinking about it in a holistic way. Perfect. But we also have to make sure that the voices from the global south are heard. We also have to make sure that, vulnerable populations are integrated into that research. So I feel like some of those drivers that we have at our disposal in terms of publishing, whether that be diversity inclusion statements, whether that be special issues that might focus or stimulate conversations about local context, all of that is applicable for open access. All of that's applicable for research in general. And fundamentally, we have to continue to do our job of reliable, confident, trusted research, because it's really interesting to see that after COVID, I think scientists were trusted at a higher level than our politicians, right? I mean, we have this element where we can seize the opportunities and where people started to understand, like, oh, hang on a second, there's this new piece of information. Oh, is that a preprint? I mean, on the front page of the New York Times, they talked about an accepted manuscript. I mean, who would have thought about that like 10 years ago? So we start having the idea that people understand what scientific publishing is about, and that's a good thing. And, having that open and having that conversations in our dinner tables about, climate action, but about COVID as well. It's like, oh, no, that came out, but that was a preprint or that was an accepted manuscript. It was great. It was refreshing. It didn't feel like we're in this little niche area. And that's a good conversation. So I feel like the conversation and Open Access Week and linking it to climate justice is a great opportunity for us to talk about the scientific process. What does that mean? To think about those ideas such as diversity and inclusion, and to think about scholarly communication. Is it about more research? Is it about, looking at mission-driven research? And it's probably going to be a mixture of everything. And that's okay, because we've only got about 7 years left in order to really move the needle here. And this is one of those elements that is going to help drive it, along with a lot of different other elements as well. And I think we have to be a little bit honest and realistic in that.
I have one last question. We've spoken about the contribution of open access. We've talked about science communication. Now I'm just wondering if, from the point of view of academic research specifically, do you think that the current publishing system, whether it's the subscription model or the open access model, is it equipped to deal with the challenge of, disseminating critical climate research fast enough?
In short, I would say, yes, it has to be. This is the system that we've got. And like I said, we've only got a few years in which to make the decisions. Now, we already have enough research in order to make some really great changes within our society, within our, on a policy level. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're advocating for science, that we stand up for the scientists. Like I said, their contributions have been amazing. And yet I know scientists in the health community in the lead up to COP26 came together to say, we're at a crisis. You need to address climate change because we're at a health crisis. We know that scientists came together in 2020 to sign a petition to say, these are the 10 actions that you need to make as a society, right? They identified all of that. Renewable energy was about food processors. The contributions are amazing. And what we need to do is we need to think through, it's not about publishing more research. It's not about making sure that it's blue sky thinking versus mission driven. It's really about, okay, we have a whole heap of research already. How do we make sure that that is getting into the hands of those who need it and that we're advocating for our scientists? Now, that could be through publicizing the latest research, getting it out into the media, as we saw with COVID, right? Not every topic is going to be on the front page of the New York Times or your, national paper. So how do we bring it to the attention? And like I said, I think there's a role here about informing the public. And there's a lot of studies. I mean, again, we just look at our own research. There's a lot of studies about how do you communicate, which frame do you communicate climate change? Because it's hard, right? We're challenging people to change as individuals, as businesses, and at a government level. And that's really difficult. So in terms of, regardless of what it is, we need to communicate scholarly research, and we need to continue to do that. Should there be improvements? I'd love to see innovation on there. I think it's a really exciting way. How do we discover research? The amount of research increases every year. How do we make sure that the humanities, here's what social sciences, here's what physical sciences, here's what life sciences is doing, and how could they all bring that together? And that's where I think improvements could happen, that inter-transdisciplinary. How do you get a chemist or an engineer who has deep knowledge? Super, great, fantastic. How do you get him to start thinking about that human element? How do I get an engineer to understand, oh, okay, well, I might put the wind farm here, but what does that mean in terms of biodiversity? Or I might do some fracking here. What does that mean for the local community? How do we start getting that? And that's a sustainability mindset within the academic culture, but it's also about us thinking about how we might share those findings, the research. How do we get them into the ecosystem of the jargon that's so specific sometimes to communities? How do we get them to, talk easy? And I think one of the interesting things, one of our journals does, One Earth, which is the Cell Press, our big sustainability journal, is that they start thinking about curated issues, right? So every issue tells a story. Every issue tries to think of different perspectives. They'll ask policymakers, or they might ask a Global South researcher to comment on what's happening. So I do think there's some drivers and some opportunities for us to really think about, how do we tell a better story? How do authors tell a better story? How do we make sure we don't burden authors and they can do their research, but don't have to think about, oh my God, I have to tell an amazing story now. And all of that is going to happen in parallel. But I think you can't throw out a scholarly communication system, because we need it. We need to continue to publish. It needs to be quality. It needs to be trusted. And we need to be informing these really important synoptic science policy documents that are going to a European Commission, that are going to the Australian government, that is going to Congress, in order to make the right decisions. And I think that is where we can start thinking about, okay, what innovations might happen? How do we evolve the system to maybe think about these sorts of elements? And, it's not that it's not happening. It's not that those conversations are not happening, or that we're not thinking about things. But first and foremost, I think, we have to work with what we've got. And surprisingly enough, I think to build a seawall, we don't need another technology, right? We just needed some accountability. And maybe that's what climate justice is all about.